Well, folks, let me just say, first of all, that I am very pleased to be here tonight, and I'm honored to be here to address your NAMI group. I've had the opportunity to speak to some of the NAMI organizations over in Beaufort and Hilton Head and Bluffton, Brunswick area, but this is my first time here in Savannah, so it's a pleasure to meet all of you. I kind of distinguish between the kind of talks that I give to people, two different kinds, okay? And one is a talk from the head, where we're just talking about knowledge or basic information. The other is talk from the heart. And I love it when I get that opportunity to actually speak to people about something that really matters to you, but especially that matters to me. Because everybody in here is in here because you need support, you have suffered a lot, I have no question about that, and I have done the same thing. And not to say that I don't have work still to do or that I don't still have problems in my life, I certainly do. But I think I can say I came out on the other side. I'm living a life today that is a million miles from anything I conceived of when I was, at my lowest point. You were speaking earlier about depression, and I was really thinking about that because a lot of times with anxiety, depression seems to be kind of welded to it. It's very common that you get the two together. When you folks were going through the principles of support, you asked about if I had an issue because I was circling and underlining some things. It wasn't that. It was that I was so impressed by some of the principles. They just kind of jump out at me. I really love that when I see these are things that, really work. I'm a pragmatic kind of person. The stuff that's in the textbooks, that's fine, but I'm really interested in what worked in my life, what's working in my life today, what's going to work in your life. So that's what I like to talk a little bit about. A little background. You probably know this, but anxiety has been around forever. You had a humorous thing here that you handed out about Noah's Ark that I liked very much. Okay, think back. All right, let's go back to the book of Genesis. It's way back when, And let's say you're Noah. You hear this voice come out of the clouds. Noah, I have a job for you. With all the world but you, I am displeased, and I shall put an end to all but you. Of all the animals, I'll have you keep 2, and you and your wife shall start anew. Begin right now before it's dark, and for all of you, build an ark to carry you over the flood I'll send. Make it strong in several ways. The rain will last for 40 days. Talk about a panic attack. Wouldn't that be enough to really set you off? If you go back in the Bible, you go back in Grimm's fairy tales, the fairy tales we heard. Okay, think about that poor guy, Jack and the Beanstalk. He climbs up that beanstalk, right? He's walking on the clouds. He smells some fresh bread. Oh, that smells good. Has anybody read The Hunger Games yet or seen that movie? Well, it's great. I want to recommend both of them. Anyway, they talk about the boy who's in it, Peeta. He's the son of the baker, and how wonderful the smell of the bread is. So that's what Jack experienced when he was at the top of the beanstalk. He said, this is fabulous. I have got to check this out. Jack crawls in the window, and what happens? Fee, fi, fo, fum. I smell the blood of an Englishman. Be he live or be he dead, I'll grind his bones to make my bread. Okay, it's another panic attack, right? Yeah. Let's face it, there is anxiety, since time began. It's a very natural thing. And when we experience it too much, it's horrendous. But when it's just right, it does serve a purpose. Yeah.
I got one for you.
Okay.
What about David and Goliath? That was definitely a panic attack.
You're absolutely right. First for David and then for Goliath. Yes,
he told David, he says, a little kid is going to do away with me? I don't think so.
Right.
And it was just one rock and a slingshot and wham.
Right. Nailed him.
Down he went.
That's absolutely right. So that's a very good example. We've got panic-stricken people all throughout history, right? But let's think back to a time in the beginning times when anxiety was very useful as well. And I'm thinking about cavemen and cave women, dinosaurs, saber-toothed tigers. By show of hands, how many have heard of the fight or flight experience? Fight or flight. Okay, great. Fight or flight just means that when you are faced with a dangerous situation, and again, I'm going to go back to this analogy where we've got this saber-toothed tiger, and let's say he's chasing after you. Back in prehistoric times, you got two choices. Flight is one. You can run as fast as you can and see if you can outrun that saber-toothed tiger. Or number two, you can fight. You were talking about being a fighter earlier. You know, you can put up your dukes and you can fight. Well, what happens when we have anxiety is we have the makings of a solution, at least a temporary one, for that fight or flight experience. Okay? Adrenaline. What happens when we get anxious? The adrenaline starts to flow into our system. And adrenaline has some very interesting effects. It speeds up our heart rate, doesn't it? Causes us to sweat. Get a little bit wobbly in the knees. We call it rubber knees. Sometimes we are dizzy. There are a number of things. Our stomachs can get upset. And it's because the blood flow goes to the areas in our big muscles, like in our legs and in our arms, and we're going to be able to hightail it if we need to. All this is just to say that the original plan for us as human beings made a lot of sense, and it still does. Today, if you're walking across the street and all of a sudden a Mack truck is bearing down on you, you aren't going to think about it. You're going to start to run. The adrenaline, you don't have to tell it to flow through your veins. It's automatically going to do that, right? So it serves a purpose. But we have a problem when we're in modern society and we're sitting at home and all of a sudden our heart starts to beat very fast. Our breathing maybe becomes labored. What's wrong with me? What's happening? All of a sudden beads of sweat might break out. What is going on? I have no explanation for what is happening to me. So what happens? I get scared. And what happens when we get scared? More adrenaline pours into our systems. And so our heart beats even faster. And it's a circuitous kind of a route that runs through our system and makes us more and more frightened. And that is one of the building blocks of what is happening when you experience a panic attack. Okay? All right. My first panic attack occurred on my 21st birthday. You don't have to say if you don't want to, but is anybody willing to admit if you've ever had a panic attack or not? Okay, it looks like almost half the room. Okay? And in society, the numbers are not much less statistically than that. The majority of women, for example, will have a panic attack during their lifetime, at least one. A lower number of men, but a lot of men will have a panic attack. Okay, and there are a number of reasons for this, but mine occurred on my 21st birthday. I grew up in Atlanta, and I was home from college on my 21st birthday. My sisters had planned a wonderful day for me. It was a Saturday morning, and they were going to take me to the House of Pancakes at the intersection of Briarcliff and Claremont in Atlanta. If anybody knows where that is, there was an IHOP there. So got up, I was very excited, went with my sisters, and started talking with them and just having a good time. Drank several cups of coffee, which in retrospect was not a good idea because, as you're probably aware, caffeine is also one of those things that causes your heart to race and can mimic or create, in fact, some of those symptoms that we associate with anxiety and with panic. Well, after breakfast, I thanked my sisters. I got in my car and started driving south on I-85 toward the Georgia Tech campus because I had borrowed some books from Georgia Tech to do a term paper, had to return them that morning. And I started south, and all of a sudden, as I was driving along, those symptoms started. My heart started beating, and I had the craziest thought. I thought, oh my God, what if I lose control and I turn my car into the oncoming traffic? Where did that come from? I had no idea. But I can tell you that I was petrified. And the main reason I was petrified was I was not absolutely sure that I would not do that. Where did this come from? I got off at the exit for Georgia Tech and went to the campus, trembling. I went in. I was devastated. I thought, either I am dying of a heart attack or I am going crazy. I've never felt this way before. Totally overwhelmed by this and drenched in sweat. So I went into one of the buildings, and a very nice lady who was a secretary at Georgia Tech just happened to be in an office that Saturday morning, let me sit down. Eventually my wife was called. I'm sorry, not my wife. My mother was called, and my aunt came and got me and took me back home. Well, that was my first panic attack, and it was horrendous. And if the story ended there, I wouldn't be here talking to you today. And as much as I'm enjoying this, I wish that the story had ended there and I weren't here talking to you today. But let me say that over the next 10 years, I continued to have a lot of panic attacks. It was bad enough that I went ahead and changed my major in college. I was up at North Georgia College in Dahlonega. Anybody know that one? Okay, so I changed my major to psychology. I took nothing but psychology my entire senior year, searching desperately for some answer. And at that time, they thought, well, this may be a psychoanalytic problem, a psychodynamic problem. Well, the first chance I got, despite my great fears, I hightailed it for Denver with a buddy of mine. We got in a car and went to Denver, told our parents we were going on a skiing vacation, got an apartment. To make a long story short, I started bartending, self-medicating, of course. That's a way that you do it, you know. I could still be there. I could make a living. I could pay for therapy. I went and saw, unfortunately, the wrong kind of therapist for this particular problem. I saw somebody who was psychoanalytically oriented and wanted to delve into the depths of my past. And I won't say that there's not value to that. I think there definitely is. But for people who have panic disorder or panic disorder with agoraphobia, there's a kind of therapy called cognitive behavioral therapy. And it's very important when you're trying to get better on a grassroots level. So, over the next 10 years, I got worse instead of better. I spent thousands of dollars, and I became very dependent on a therapist, only to get worse. Well, let's cut to closer to the end of the story. The year was 1980, and my parents had talked me into coming back to Georgia. I flew back to Georgia with a Xanax to get me on the plane, and my sister to accompany me as my safe person. Flew back into Atlanta. I lived with my grandmother in Atlanta, and I had a doctor next door, my uncle, Bill. He was the greatest guy, and I felt some kind of confidence because I had a doctor next door. I was scared to death, about all these bodily symptoms. Went to the Emory Clinic and saw an excellent psychiatrist who happened to be psychoanalytic, but he knew enough to say, you know what, I'm going to teach you about some of the things you need to do to get well. And I'll go into those briefly in a moment, cognitive behavioral therapy. So I got much better. I was able to get a job. It wasn't rosy. I was reminded when you mentioned that you were looking for a job, and I know how difficult that can be. Because of depression, because of anxiety, because of any number of things, it can be very difficult. For me, I got a job where, despite the fact I was basically homebound and scared to death to go anywhere, my uncle lent me a car. There was no air conditioning. It was summer in Atlanta. It was over 100 degrees. I would take off my shirt every day in that old car and get in the car with a gallon jug of water, and I would drive 20 miles to my uncle's company, and he paid me, which was fabulous. He paid me minimum wage to put wheels together. He had a company that it was very simple work. But I would do that, and I dreaded it, and I hated it. And at lunchtime, my grandmother would pack me a lunch. I was 30 years old, and I would sit and eat my lunch and think how much I hated it and how I couldn't wait for the day to be over. But I did my job, and then I'd drive that horrendous drive back home. I got better, and I got better. Baby Steps. You remember that movie? What's the name of that movie? What About Bob? You remember that? What About Bob? And they joke about it. Baby steps. But it's so true. Baby steps. That's how I did it. And that's how the people I know who have recovered have done it. You talked about not criticizing yourself and being supportive of yourself. That's so very important. We're brought up to be so critical. So I learned to pat myself on the back, even when other people, if I'd said something to them, they probably would have laughed. But you know what? You folks continue to pat yourselves on the back for every tiny little progress you make, because that is the way to get better. At any rate, I went ahead, I had my undergraduate degree. As time went on, I had sales jobs. I had sold when I was a little kid, just, greeting cards and stuff like that. So I got a sales job. I got trained in that. I became a sales trainer for Dale Carnegie and Associates. I was hired away for a medical sales job. Things just kept falling into place, one baby step after another. Eventually, I decided I want to go back to school, and I'd like to help other people who have problems with anxiety. So I went to the University of Georgia, and I got a master's degree in clinical or psychiatric social work. I then went ahead and took baby steps, to get my supervision. I'm now a licensed clinical social worker. I do things today that I wouldn't ever have thought at my depths were remotely possible. And it's not that they're anything that are so unbelievable. It's just that they are so far out of the realm of possibility that I would have considered for myself. Last year, I spoke at the Anxiety Disorders Association of America at the National Conference in New Orleans. I would never have thought I could get on an airplane to fly there, much less speak to a group there. I wrote a book. I have a new book out called Homebound No More. Would I have thought I could have done that? Certainly not. There are just so many things that I have been able to accomplish thanks to the grace of God, and also to a few other things that I'm going to address very briefly with you, but that I think can be helpful to you in your recovery. If I may, one of them is inspiration. Okay? When I first came back from Denver and I was in Atlanta, I was the opposite of inspired. I was really despondent. Certainly I had depressive symptoms. You know what those are. You can't sleep at night. Your sleep's all messed up. You have problems with your appetite. You're either eating too much or too little. Difficulty concentrating. Sadness. Crying spells. Some people have thoughts of suicide or just general thoughts about death. Slowed down. So I was on that end of the continuum. I was looking for something that could make me feel better. Well, somebody recommended some books by a lady named Dr. Claire Weeks. And I read them, and I was on top of the world, because here was a doctor from Australia who was telling me, don't worry about your heart beating so fast. Do you realize that your heart can beat at a rate that is like 1.5 times that fast for a week before your heart would begin to have any damage? And I thought, oh, this is fabulous. Maybe I am going to be okay. She talked about dizziness. She talked about the wobbly legs. All her clients had these sorts of problems. So I was inspired by that. As time went on and I eventually was able to join the Anxiety Disorders Association of America, I went to the conferences and I met people who wrote the books, the people who I admired, who had, inspired me. And I said, how do you do, Rex Briggs? You helped me. Or Monty Fenninger. You really helped me. The fellow who wrote this book, I just picked this up on my way out. It's one of the anxiety book by Dr. Jonathan Davidson. He's at Duke University. Dr. Davidson spent time talking to me, I don't know, maybe 5 or 10 years ago, specifically about what are the problems I'm encountering in my continued,
I'm sorry.
it's all right, getting past the problems I was having. So inspiration is very important. You can find examples of people who have recovered from everything under the sun, and certainly including anxiety disorders, depression, who have learned to live successfully despite the difficulties of schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, all these things. So inspiration is one of those things. Another I've mentioned is cognitive behavioral therapy. What does that mean? Just a big term for cognitive, of course, that's our thoughts. What are we thinking? Well, How about if I'm thinking, you know what, when my heart's beating like that so fast, maybe I'm afraid I'm having a heart attack. Well, in the midst of that, I may be convinced, oh my gosh, yeah, this feels like a heart attack. But at another time, if you took me out of that situation and said, Blaise, what's the real likelihood, logically, that you, at your age and in your physical condition, are probably having a heart attack? I might have gone, yeah, it's probably not that high. If I'd had several heart attacks, then I might really be concerned. I say, well, you know, I need to take that seriously. Maybe I'll go to the emergency room anyway. But in my case, that was not the situation. So what are those thoughts? Depressive thoughts. Am I telling myself I'm worthless? Well, you know that. Well, in a way, I think we often tell ourselves that. And yet, have other people given you other information at times that you're not a worthless person?
Yep.
Me too. I think all of us have a choice there. Are we going to give in? And I use that advisedly. Give in's not really the best term. Am I going to accept these thoughts that come to me like, oh, Blaise, you're a loser, you know, you feel down in the dumps and you should feel down in the dumps? Or am I going to grab hold of something else and say, you know what, I felt this way before, and my sister, Jeannie, wouldn't let me feel that way. Jeannie said, Blaise, you know better than that. Don't you remember when you did this and that and you overcame something? Let's think about those things. Let's write them down. You were discussing doing the journaling, and I love that. What a tool. Why not make a list that is going to call into question some of those negative thoughts that we have? These are all, again, cognitions. Don't accept things that you've always just said, well, I've always been that way. I must just be that way. Not necessarily. Not at all.
Like when I'm bipolar with schizophrenic tendency.
Okay.
Every once in a while, if I get real depressed, I'll hear, you ain't no good. Why you taking up this air? Nobody loves you. You're a piece of you know what. And I said, wait a minute. I am somebody. You know, and I haven't had that come in my head in about 3 years now. You know, because I finally said, I am somebody. I'm a mother. I'm a grandmother. I try to help people as best I can. I am a somebody. I'm not a nobody.
No, you're not. And you just gave a perfect example of that. You know, taking concrete things like I am a mother, I am a grandmother. Those are things you can hang a hat on. You know, you can actually say, yes, I do have those things going for me. And I would encourage you all to write down those. You may already do this, but write down those positives that are going to give you the ammunition when these negative thoughts come up. Okay, so those are the cognitions. That's one side of it. The other side is behavioral, cognitive behavioral. Those are my behaviors. And this is where I want to go back to the psychiatrist at the Emory Clinic who helped me so much. I had to get from the bottom floor of the Emory Clinic up to his office on the 3rd floor, and I had to take the elevator. And I want to tell you, I had a horrible fear of getting in the elevators. So you know what I had to do? I had to risk it. I just had to do whatever I had to do to get on the darn elevator and go up to see him. And then each morning, even though I was terrified, I had to get in that car that belonged to my aunt and uncle, and I had to drive to work. I just had to find a way to do that. Now, in my case, this also involved medication. Some of you may take medication or believe in medications, others may not. There are great treatments for anxiety on both sides. There are cognitive behavioral, and there are certain medications which can be extremely useful for people with severe anxiety like I had, because there was no way I was going to be able to do the things I need to do unless I could at least minimize some of those effects. So we've got inspiration, and we've got cognitive behavioral techniques. There are a whole bunch of them. There are books filled with them. And then finally, and I wanted to end with this one, there is exactly what you folks are doing right here. There is the support of other people. This has been proven to help, as you know, it's the very foundation of NAMI, I believe, to help us to get better. We need to support one another. We need to reach out and find support from other people. It's one thing when you're feeling great and everything's okay, and it's probably easier to come to this meeting at times like that. But there are times when you feel like crap. You know, there are times for all of us when we feel like that. Those are the times when it is most important that we have a support network. Somebody mentioned getting up and praying in the morning. Yes, thank you. If you have a belief system that has a higher power, I would say that is a very, very strong way to tap into that strength. There is spirituality, there is being around other people. Exercise was brought up. One of your members likes to exercise. Exercise was huge for me. I'm going to go back to the baby steps. When I first went to my grandmother's house, I was very frightened to go to the mailbox. 30 years old, and I couldn't walk from the front door to the mailbox. But eventually, I made it to the mailbox. 2 of my uncles came to see me, and one of them said, Blaise, you need to get out and exercise. You were an athlete when you were in high school and college. You need to get out. You know, it's going to help you. You need to do that. And I thought about it, but I thought, I'm scared to death. I cannot get out there and exercise. I just can't do it. The other uncle came and said, hey, I'll run with you. I'll start running around the block with you. And I said, gee, I'd love to do that, but I'll just tell you, I'm scared to death to get my heart rate up. I will walk. He said, no, I'm not going to walk with you, man. If you're ready to run, I'll run with you. So there was nobody to do that. But you know what? I was able to walk after a couple weeks from one mailbox to the next mailbox. And then I walked eventually to the next mailbox. My grandmother lives in the Emory area of Atlanta. And eventually I was able to walk all the way around the block. It took a while. And then I built up to where I could jog just a little bit. And after a while, I was jogging 4 miles in that area. How did I do that? Baby steps. Now, of course, I never had a setback, did I? Wrong. I had lots of setbacks. There were times when I'd get out there and the old fear would come up again. And I'd just have to battle it down. Maybe I didn't run the whole way that day. Maybe I said I can only make it half the way. But at the end of the run, I'd say to myself, you did good, Blaise. It's a tough day, buddy. I had to be on my team. You have to be on your team.
Halfway was better than not doing it at all.
Right, right. So my message to you from my experience, and I emphasize that it's just my story, it's just my experience. Each of us is unique, but these are things that have worked for me. Find a role model. Find somebody who's done it. Find somebody who's 5 yards ahead of where you are right now. Follow that person. Study that person. Use whatever techniques you can, both with your mind and with your behaviors. Risk it. Try thinking a new thought. Try behaving a little differently. And finally, continue to nourish this kind of support that you have in your group here, because you are your own best weapon against the illness you're fighting, mental illness.
You're also your worst enemy.
You can be, but it's a bit of a choice. When you can choose the other side.
Right.
Thank you very much.
Thank